So this is our camshaft that the customer provided. Even though this has already been through the breakthrough and we know it's a known good cam, you want to be generous with the assembly lube on this. So you want to lube up that gear, the distributor gear on the back, and then a little on the... So as we install this, I will take my assembly lube here, and we want to make sure that we get assembly lube on all of these journals and these mains. Install this cam gently. I will usually let it hang right there, and then I'm going to lube up these first 4 lobes. I don't lube them all because I don't want the assembly lube to drip all over the floor. Then I just carefully go ahead and get the cam into that point, let it hang on the next journal, put a little bit of assembly lube on that one, and then kind of rotate that around so it's nice and distributed there. And then I'll just go ahead and continue this with each section of lobes so that we make sure that we got decent lube on those lobes. And the same thing goes for the lifters when we go to put those in. Later on, we're going to want to lube up the bottom of those lifters. Flat tappets need a lot of lubrication on them. Now, if this was a roller cam, I would not be putting assembly lube on these lobes, because that could cause an issue with the roller wanting to actually roll on that lobe. But since the flat tappet lifter is sliding on here, we definitely want to make this as slippery and lubricated as possible. So we'll get the cam all the way in here. And I like to put the cam in first because you see I got my hand back here on the back side. That can kind of help guide this in. We also have a fuel pump eccentric up here, and you just want to put a little lube on that, and then the front journal, and then just carefully get this installed to those cam bearings. And of course, when the cam is in there, it should rotate freely. You should be able to grab this pin here and rotate that cam. You're going to feel a little resistance because of the lubrication, but that is your camshaft installation. Now that that cam is installed and pushed back inside here, now we can go ahead and install the crankshaft. You can use this assembly lube on the crank, but I like to use engine oil on these because that's where the crank lives, and we know that this engine is going to run relatively soon after we get it assembled. So we're just, if this was going to sit for a long time, I might put assembly lube on those bearings, but this is going to be a run in short order, so we can go ahead and put those on. Now, real important here, on the early blocks, you got a 2-piece rear main seal here. The seal looks like this. This is out of our Felpro set. We want to put, and the 2 halves are the same on this. We want to take and put our upper half of our rear main seal in before we actually lay the crank. It has to go in first. And you see there's a flat area in the back, and then there's this lip. This lip area right here is going to go in toward the oil. So we're just going to put that on the groove. My motion detector light keeps going off. I got to change that stupid light. And so we've got the lip toward the oil, and that's our rear main seal. Now that you get to that point, you can go ahead and lay your crank in the engine. We just take our crank that has been cleaned and polished and mic'd and inspected, and we went in and scrubbed all our oil holes here. So our crank is nice and clean and prepped and ready to go in. So we just lay it in there simply like that. When you rotate the crankshaft before the caps are on and torqued, you might feel a little bit of resistance here because the bearings have to be crushed. When we put the cap on and we torque the caps, the ends of these bearings here are going to butt up against each other, and that torquing creates a crush there that makes the bearing perfectly round. Before you torque your caps, the bearings are actually a little bit oval shaped. They're not round. We want to put a generous amount of oil on the tops of those, each main journal, before we install our caps, because we want these lubricated. Now I want to draw your attention to something here real quickly on the back, guys. That is your rear main seal. The other half of your rear main seal is going to go into the rear cap right here. And again, the lip right there is going to face the oil. So I want that lip, as I install it, to be facing the bearing where the oil is. So I've got my lip in there facing the bearing. Now another issue here with this, and this is something that's pretty critical that you want to pay attention to. Right here where the cap mates to the block next to the rear main seal, that's this area right here. One of the things that you really want to be aware of is the fact that you need to put a little bit of silicone sealer here on each side, because you've got metal to metal here, and if you don't put sealer on there, you will have oil seeping out of the back of this block, and we don't want to do that. So we're very simply going to take our RTV black here, and we're just going to smear some of this on that mating surface on both sides to make sure that we don't have any oil seepage out the back of the engine, because if leaks are not good for anyone involved. Now that you've got that done, we can go ahead and lay our cap on there, but we also want to make sure that we have these threads here lubricated. We've already got our journal lubricated, so we're just going to take these bolts here. I've got a container of oil, and we're just going to make sure that we've got some oil, some lubrication. You don't want too much, just enough to coat them and make sure they're not dry. Okay, so now we've got some engine oil on those. So now you can just go ahead and lay your cap on there. Use your bolts as guides, and remember the rear main seals are back here. They're going to mate each other. So we're just going to lay the cap on there gently. Now, really important here, these caps fit into a pocket, and it's kind of a tight fit. So once you get that in there, you need to take a soft hammer or something, and you need to tap that cap down. Make sure it's flush, because it could damage the cap if you don't get that flush and you try to torque these bolts. One thing you don't want to do though is pound on those pins for the oil pump. Just pound on that flat boss area, and then you want to take a look over here where the cap mates the block right there, and you want to make sure that this cap is flush. It's all the way down into that pocket on both sides, and this one is. The cap's down. At that point, you can just snug your bolts up, and then we're going to get the rest of the caps on. Now, we've already oiled all the bolts on this. Make sure that your bearing is installed and that you have the correct number cap. So this says number 4 on it, and the arrow faces the front of the engine here. So we know that the arrow, with the arrow facing forward, and you can move your crank if you want, just go ahead and use your bolts as guides and get these caps on. This is my number 3 cap. So we're going to put it in the number 3 location with the arrow facing forward. Our number 2 cap here, arrow forward. And then of course we're going to go up front with our front cap, arrow forward. And just go ahead and get your caps on there in their respective locations. Now again, really important here, take a soft hammer or something like that and tap these caps down. You can hear them clicking into that pocket. Caps snug down, and we're looking here and we can see that the caps are flush in that pocket area on both sides, and now we can go ahead and we can snug those bolts. Before you torque the caps, like I said earlier, what you'll notice is you turn this crank and you feel a little bit of resistance here. In fact, when I put my crankshaft rotation tool on, you'll notice that the weight of this will not even move that crank. But what happens as I snug these caps up and start to torque them, the ends of the bearings are going to butt up, and it's going to create the crush fit and make that bearing perfectly round. And I'm not even going to torque these at this point, guys. I'm just going to take a socket and a ratchet. I'm just going to lightly snug these to what I know is way less than what the final torque is. And as I snug these up, you're going to notice something about this breaker bar, because what I'm doing is, as I snug these, I'm crushing those, I'm creating the crush on the bearings, and of course, see, there it goes. So you see that as I started to make these bearings round, it actually freed up the crank, and simply the weight of this breaker bar freed up the crank and allowed it to turn. So I got all my bearings, my bearing caps seated, and I'm just putting a light just a little past hand tight on these, and that actually creates bearing crush. And that's actually what keeps the bearings from spinning. A lot of people think it's the bearing notch that keeps it from spinning. That's not what it is. It's what holds that bearing tight in that bore is that crush. And now, when I turn this thing frees right up. I mean, I can turn this with one finger. And you always want to rotate this all the way around. Take and feel it with your hand. The reason that I like to use engine oil when I can, if I know the engine's going to run relatively quickly, is because I want to feel the way this crank turns in its natural habitat. I want to know if there's a bind. If you put thick assembly lube on here, it makes the crank actually harder to turn, and you're not really sure if it's binding or if it's just the assembly lube. When you get oil in here, man, I can just turn this crank with one finger. We've got our caps on. We've got all these just hand tight, and our crankshaft rotates. When you torque your crankshaft, you want to start in the middle, and we're going to go to 3 steps. You're going to set your torque wrench for 3 different settings. We're going to start, our final torque on this is 65, so we're going to go 25, 45, and 65. So we're going to start here in the middle, and we're going to do the center cap at 25 foot-pounds. We're going to move to the next cap, and we're just going to alternate. We're going to come back here to this cap, come back up to the front, and we're just going to alternate. Once you get that done, then you go to your outer bolts, and we start again with the center cap, and then alternate from front to back. And now we've got all of our caps torqued to 25 foot-pounds, which is not much. You want to make sure that your crankshaft turns freely. There shouldn't be any binding at all. Now the next step, we're going to reset our torque wrench for 45. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to start in the middle again, and we're going to snug this down to 45. Now when you get to the second step, every time you snug a cap, go ahead and give the crank a turn and make sure that it didn't bind up. That way, if one of these starts binding or causing a problem, you'll know which one it is, instead of having to go back and check them all. So 45 here. Give the crank a turn, make sure there's no binding. And then of course our rear cap. Then come back and do your outer bolts again. Start in the center and alternate. Now we're going to go to our final torque setting, which is 65 foot-pounds. So we're going to reset our wrench for 65 and do our final torque. All right, here we go, 65 foot-pounds. Alright, that's our final torque on our inner bolts, and this crank turns real nice, has no binding. Looks like we're in good shape. Go back to the middle on your outer bolts. Make sure the crank turns with no binding. Now, one final step. Once you get that done, it's always a best practice to go over and check every bolt. And you want to count the bolts. This is a 4-bolt main block, so it has 16 bolts. You don't have to do it in order. You want to start at one end and work your way down this way and just count to 16. And we're just double checking that we didn't miss anything. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. When you're done torquing, always loosen up the torque wrench and take all the tension off of it. If you leave this torque wrench tensioned, it can actually damage the torque wrench. This is not something you have to do, but I like to. Anytime I torque something, especially if I'm not going to finish the entire engine one day, I will always take a metal marker and I'm just going to mark my bolts that I just torqued. That way when I come back to this thing a day or two later, if I'm waiting for parts or something like that, I'm going to know for sure that I torqued those bolts. It just is just a good reference point to help you remember. And that is basically it. If your crank turns good, you're good to go. Now that you've got your crank installed, another really important step that we need to make sure that we don't skip, and that is we need to put a dial indicator on a magnetic base on the end of the crankshaft, and we need to gently pry the crank back and forth to make sure that we have crankshaft end play. So you want to take a small pry bar or a big screwdriver, and we're going to pry this crank back and forth to make sure that we have end play. As I pry that crank back and forth, you can see the end play movement on this thing. That's really good end play. 3 to 6 or 7 or 8, even 8 is good. A little extra clearance is infinitely better. This is about 6 to 7 thousandths, which is really good end play. We're very happy with that. The one thing you don't want to do is have one that's too tight. Those flanges back here are controlling this as the engine runs. It's a little better to be on the loose side. If you ever get one that's 1 or 2 thousandths end play, that's a little tight, and that can be a problem.
Okay guys, so obviously I did some work off camera. We need to install our piston and rod assemblies. I didn't really want to bore you with filming all 8 of the piston and rod assemblies going in. If you really want to see all 8 of them go in, just watch what I'm going to do next and rewind it 8 times and watch it 8 times, because it's the exact same thing. So you really only need to see this once. What we have here is our piston and rod assembly, our 30 over piston with the flat top and 4 valve reliefs, coated skirt, sealed power, hyper-eutectic piston. We've got our ring package on here. Now, one of the things that you want to do before you put this in, if you look here, you can see I've got the 2 compression rings. The ring gaps are lined up there. You want to stagger those. You want to take and put them on opposite sides of the piston. You don't want those lined up or it could smoke. And then of course we have our oil ring package here. This is a semi-floater, so we use the rod heater to heat the rods and press these on. And then we've got our Clevite 663P10 under bearings, and we've installed them in the connecting rod and the piston. So this is our connecting rod assembly that is ready to go in. Now we've got a couple of tools here. This is a cone style ring compressor. It's a tapered cone, and you need a different cone for each bore size. One thing you'll notice, if you can see it there, it says 4.030 on this. So this is for the 30 over bore. If this were a standard bore, like a 4 inches or a 60 over or whatever, you would need a cone that corresponded with that particular size. A standard, you need a 4-inch cone, for example. All right, so now we are going to install our piston and rod assembly into our bore. This is the way that I would advise doing it. You never want to put these in dry, so I will just stand the rod up like so, and then I just put a little bit of oil or assembly lube on there. I'm using oil on this one. And it'll run down the sides, and if it runs down, it'll run down and get on that pin. That's fine. The piston and rod, the piston itself needs to have some lubrication on it. I will just use a light coating of oil, or I'll even spray it with some WD-40. Some of you are going to flip out about that, but Total Seal actually recommends that you put WD-40 on the piston skirt and the rings for installation. So you can take that up with them if you think you're smarter than the biggest performance ring manufacturer in the world. You call them and have a debate with them. But I'm actually going to take their advice because I know a lot of the guys. They're local here in my area. I've been to their shop and they know their stuff. So if they say it's okay and they do it, I think I'm going to go with their advice. All right, we also put new rod bolts and we have new nuts for this, and we resize the rods. All right, let's go to our engine, and I will show you how we install this. First thing what you want to do is, and this is how I do it, you want to take your cone, and the thin side of the cone obviously goes up. So we're going to go ahead And I would just take and put my piston in that cone. I would just take and put my piston in that cone and get that cone all the way down in there, right? We've got our rings in there. We've got it inside our compressor cone. That's the best way to do it. Then we're going to go over to our engine. Now, a really important step here, you guys, we got to make sure these bores are clean. And of course, we final washed it and everything. Take a little WD-40 and you just want to wipe out that crosshatch and make sure we don't have any kind of grit or dirt or anything in there. This one looks really clean. We've already super cleaned this block. But if this comes off of there and you got black stuff on that, you need to wipe that bore out with WD-40 and clean towels, non-lint-free towels, until you get absolutely nothing on your towel except WD-40 like we have here. So that bore is really clean and it's ready. Now we're going to take our piston and ring compressor, and remember the dot on the piston, there is a dot, we got our 4-valve release, goes to the front of the engine. So it's going to go this way, and your bearing tangs or locating notches are going to go to the outside of the block here. You're going to have 4 rods on one way and 4 rods on the other way for the other banks. You got to make sure that you get your rod facing the right way. Just remember, dot forward, bearing notches are going to be to the outside. So we're just going to carefully get our piston skirts started down in that bore and get that ring compressor flush right up against the bore like that. Now on the other end, we have to make sure that we protect our crankshaft. We've got these hardened steel rod studs in here. We don't want to jam those into the crank. And you see I've got all 7 of the other pistons in already. This is a journal protector, and I like these. I use this actually in the disassembly video, but I will go ahead and run this over the crank journal, and we're just going to get that onto the connecting rod. Once we get that on the connecting rod, then we can take and drive our piston and rod assembly into the engine. Then we want to take our wooden dowel, our soft hammer handle or whatever, and we're just going to tap that piston into the bore. And there you go. Best ring compressor in the history of the universe. They have those band types, but you always got to fight with those. Once I discovered the tapered cones, I threw my band type ring compressors in the trash. So then we just continue to gently tap that piston down. Obviously, you've got to be mindful of what happens down here. So as you tap this up next to that other rod, go ahead and just make sure that that rod is not twisted. Push it flush against this throw, and make sure this rod, see these rods have movement, side clearance, make sure this rod's pulled over all the way. And then we're just going to go ahead and gently tap our piston and our rod down around the crank. You can remove your journal protector. Make sure that your bearing notch or tang matches the tang here. And again, we're to the outside of the block with our bearing locating notches. And on here, we got our bearing locating notch here. So this is also going to go to the outside of the block. And then we just gently make sure you got oil on that bearing. Then we're just going to push the cap up on there. Install your rod nuts. Just run them down finger tight, run them all the way up. And once they're up and flush, at that point, then we're ready to torque that connecting rod. After they're torqued, we want to make sure, and also just give this a tug, make sure you got movement here. But we also need to check that rod side clearance after these are torqued. And once I get these torqued, we go through the torque procedure. I'll show you how to do that. As we go through the torque procedures for the connecting rod. This one feels really good, no binding, turning nice and smooth. So I think we're good. Now we can go ahead and final torque all of our connecting rods. Okay, so we want to take our torque wrench and we want to set it. The torque on the connecting rods on our small block Chevy here is 45 foot-pounds. So we're going to go ahead and set our torque wrench to 45 foot-pounds. Then we'll go ahead and torque our rods. I start up in the front here, and I just put these rods, these here, so I can get to all 8 of them. And then I just proceed to torque the rods evenly to 45 foot-pounds. And then we'll just, every time you torque a set of rods here, these two, what I would recommend is that you rotate the engine just to make sure that the act of torquing those rods did not cause any kind of bind. So we'll go ahead and rotate it. Nothing has changed. Feels good. And of course, the next pair. Make sure you get them all. You don't want to miss any. And again, just like we did with the mains, once we're done here, we're going to go double check. Give it a rotate. Everything feels good. Move on to your next pair. Now, once I get all of these torqued, guys, what I will do, just as a double check, it's always a good idea to go back and double check all of your torques. And we have 16 rod nuts to torque here, so I like to count to 16. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. And I also do the same thing on the mains. I'll go through those and just count and double check my torques. This is a step that you don't want to skip. So I'm going to set my torque wrench for 65 foot-pounds, and I'm going to go through and I'm going to double check all the mains just to make sure. We're fairly confident that we torqued them, but this is something you can't take a chance on. If you leave one of these bolts untorqued, you are going to have a catastrophic failure of that engine. So we're going to check all of our bolts. Make sure they are torqued up to spec. So now we have double checked all the rods, and we are finishing up double checking these mains. And we know that everything on the bottom end of the engine is now torqued. Always take the tension off your torque wrench when you're done. Don't leave tension on it. That will damage the wrench. And you don't have to do this, but I do it just for self-reference because I won't finish this motor in a day. I take a metal marker and I mark every single one of these bolts here. The rods and the mains. That way when I come back to this in a day or two or a week or however long it is, I pull the bag off of it and I see these marks. And I don't have to think back and try to remember, gosh, did I torque those? I know for sure when I see this blue paint here on each one of these fasteners that I definitely torqued all of these rod and main bolts. These are very critical bolts to have torqued. If one of the rods comes loose when this engine's running, you're going to have a bunch of holes in your block and a bunch of parts on the floor, and I know nobody wants to do that. So that is crank installation and verification of that all of our fasteners are torqued. Now, one other real important check on the bottom of the motor here, guys, is rod side clearance. We need to take a filler gauge in here and measure this, and I've already done that, but what you'll see is, you see how that rod has movement? Make sure every one of these rods has movement individually. I put a feeler gauge, I spread these apart and put a feeler gauge in these off camera, and what I discovered is I have about 12 to 15 thousandths rod side clearance. So make sure they move. If they move side to side, now if you ever get one of these together and you have a pair of connecting rods and you don't have movement between them, big red flag, something's very wrong. You got a cap on backwards, you got a rod in backwards, you got a bearing that's causing a problem, that's binding up, you got a bent connecting rod, something's wrong. So that rod side clearance is a really good check and an essential check that you have to go through to make sure that this thing is healthy and these rods are installed right. I can tell you that if you get a rod on the wrong bank and you get the rod backwards, it's going to bind up here. So you never want to skipped a step of checking that. So now we've got our short block together. Everything feels great. And now we can move on to some of the other stuff, timing chain, oil pump, and all that stuff. So,
okay guys, so the next step is going to be to put our double roller chain set on. We've already pressed the gear on the crank and we marked the dot and we've got it at 6 o'clock. The best way to put this on, also I would mention, if you'll notice, we shaved the block right here. Right down here at the bottom, the block has been relieved. That's because when you put this gear on, the chain will cut into the block a lot of times. So we take a Dremel and we also swedge the edges for these plugs to make sure, dang sure they wouldn't back out. And then the best way to do this, I've seen guys really struggle putting these chains on. The best way to do it is to go ahead and put your gear on without the chain and just get a bolt started in it. If we run that bolt all the way into our cam and just get it finger tight, that allows us to locate this gear. And then we just take and make sure that our cam and our crank lines are marked up here, and they are. Now we want to take the gear back off, but you want to be careful not to move that crankshaft because we have to make sure those gears are lined up. At that point, then you want to take your gear off and go ahead and just hang your gear on the chain there. And then of course we want to bring that mark back up to where it was, put the chain on, and since we lined it up earlier, that thing will drop right onto that gear. So we'll go ahead and get a bolt in it, get another one started. Just get these finger tight, and now all we got to do is move this crank back to where it was. We want these at 6 and 12. So if we bring these marks around here, you can see they're dot to dot there, and we've got these two bolts started. We still got to put the other bolt in and torque it, but you've got your location now, and it's not a bad idea to put some Loctite on these threads. Once those are started, we'll take them out one at a time and get some Loctite on there, just as a little extra insurance. So we'll put a little Loctite on the threads on each one of these, and we are in business. And then of course we got them torqued up now, and again with the marker, now that you got these torqued dot to dot here, just mark these, make sure we know that we definitely got those bolts torqued. And that is your timing installation. It's dot to dot. Once you get those dot to dot, your piston is at top dead center over here right now, and you are you're good to go. Now we are going to degree this cam, but that'll come later. But this is a good starting point, initial timing, dot to dot. That's going to get you real close to where you need to be. And that basically is our short block. We've got rods and pistons, crank, timing chain. That's pretty much the short block. We still got to get the oil pump on, and the timing cover and the pan, but we'll get to that a little bit later, probably next actually. And then we'll move on to the top end, the cylinder heads, and so forth. Okay, so I know I told you guys I was going to do the oil pump and the bottom end and stuff, but ended up not having the right parts. So we've got our cylinder heads. We did a valve job, resurfaced them, got all new performance springs on them. Now when you put the head on, it's okay to go ahead and just set the head on there. And also we've put our Felpro 1004 head gasket on here. Now there's a couple of locating dowels. There's one here and there's one in the back. And when you set this head on there, I like to grab it in the exhaust ports there, and then back here on the intake side, it helps to get that on there. And then we're just going to look down on our bolt holes, and this will drop onto those pins. So now it's dropped onto the locating dowels. You don't really want to walk away from this, guys, for a long period of time with no bolts in it. I like to get at least one bolt started before I walk away. And also you want to make sure that your engine stand securing pin that keeps this thing from rotating is in your engine stand back here. So I'm just going to take one head bolt and put it right in the middle here and get it started a few threads. And that is going to be enough to keep that head from falling off of that block. And then of course, we're going to need to get all of our bolts in. We cleaned up all of our head bolts here. Now, one thing you want to make sure you do, all of the Chevrolet threaded holes go into the cooling system on these blocks. And so you have to put some kind of a sealer on these threads. I use Loctite. Now, again, I'm not using Loctite because I'm worried about the bolts coming loose. Loctite does a really good job. If you just put a bead of it here, it's going to put a thin bead all the way around there. Now, if you just put a bead of that there, that is going to seal those threads and keep coolant from seeping up the threads and leaking into the oil. So I will always just take and put a dab of Loctite on there and run that bolt down. I'll do that with all of them. Once I get all of these in and sealed, we'll come back and torque the cylinder heads. Okay, so now we've got all of our bolts in. We got the sealer on them, and we've got them torqued to an initial torque of 45 foot-pounds. Now I'm going to set my wrench to 65, and I'm going to go through the sequence. And the torque sequence is important to follow the torque sequence so we don't warp the head as we're putting it on. So we're just going to go to our final torque here, and we're going to go in our torque sequence. Okay, so we've got them all torqued up. Now, once again, there's 17 head bolts, and I will always, guys, go over and check every one of them and count to 17. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, the lowers here, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. Okay, now obviously, once we get these on and get this buttoned up, we're going to have to take it back to our paint area and block some of this off and paint these the Chevy orange. Remember, take the tension off of your torque wrench. Don't leave it on there because that'll damage the wrench. Now I will rotate this to the other side now that we've got this cylinder head installed. And we can bring this bank up. Put your locking bolt or pin in here. We can get our head gasket on here, and I'll get the other head on. I won't do it on camera because you just saw that. If you want to see me put both heads on, just rewind what I just did and watch it twice. Same thing. So I'll get the other head on and I'll be back. Okay, guys, so we've got the cylinder heads on, got them torqued up. The next step is going to be our lifters and our valve train. If you remember, the customer brought this cam that him and his father were going to use, but it didn't work out, and he numbered the lifters and kept them in order. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't go with a flat tappet, but this is an older cam, so like I explained earlier. And now it's just a matter of getting the lifters back in order, the push rods, the rocker arms, and getting our valve adjustment done. And then once we get that done, we'll come back and look at this bottom end, but I'll get this valve train together and I'll show you. I want to kind of walk you through the valve adjustment on this thing and talk to you about different types of valve adjustments. So a couple of tips here. One of the things that I would suggest is, you see we've got our intake manifold gaskets on here. I would recommend to take a bead of the silicone and put it on the head underneath this gasket. Put a blob of it around these ports, these 4 ports on the ends. And then go ahead and put your intake gaskets on. And again, these are directional, so it says this side up on it. Put the gaskets on and get some 3/8 bolts or studs and nuts and washers, and just run them down and snug them up on that gasket. And then what that does is that allows that gasket to set up here. That way when you go to put your intake on, it'll be adhered to the head and it doesn't move. It really does make a big difference. Now, you can see we've got all our rockers on, but I wanted to demonstrate a couple of these. One of the things you need to do is put lubricant before you put your push rods in. Take this push rod and hold it up to the light and make sure you can see through it. These push rods are hollow, so you want to hold it up and make sure there's no debris or anything clogging this, because the oil feeds up through the center of the push rod, and that's how this valve train gets its lubrication. So they have hollow push rods. And these push rods have all been clean, but even so, just look through them and make sure. Promise you guys, I'm going to get rid of that motion detector light. I didn't know that's what that was when I bought it. So that thing's going to go in the trash. Anyway, make sure that you lubricate the pressure points here once you know your push rods are clean inside. So put a little bit of assembly lube on that end where the lifter is. Put some assembly lube on here. Make sure you put some lubricant or assembly lube on the threads of the studs. You don't ever want to put this stuff together dry. And go ahead and lube both sides of that push rod. Just get it right in there on your lifter. Now the rocker arms, you have a rocker arm and then there's a fulcrum. You also want to lube that up. Put some assembly lube in on that fulcrum, just so it's not dry, and then we'll go ahead and slide that right over our rocker stud like that. And you can see I've already lubed all the rest of them. So it's okay to go ahead and put this on and then put a blob of lube in there. Now, there's a couple of different types of rocker arm hold downs. We're using the stock type on this engine. This is a stock factory rocker nut. They are crimped at the top to keep them tight. So what you'll notice is when you put these on, they go on real easy, but as you run it down, you get to the top of the stud here and it gets tight. You can't, it gets to the point where you can't turn that. They're designed like that on purpose. You always want to put new rocker nuts on if you're using this stock type, because once you run them up and down a couple times, they actually lose their ability to self-lock, and then your rockers will back off when the engine's running. So I just always replace these with new ones. They only cost about 12 bucks for the set. Cheap insurance to make sure these rockers don't back off. Alright, now the valve adjustment. I want to concentrate on these 2 valves right here. So you guys, you will need to be able to turn your crankshaft, so you want to put your crank rotation socket on the front of the motor so you can rotate this. Okay, so now on a Chevrolet, on this first cylinder here, this end rocker here is your exhaust, and this is your intake. If you get confused on that, the exhaust rockers are always in line with the exhaust port. The exhaust port's right over here. If there's no exhaust port on this side, then it's an intake. So you got 2 intakes here. Exhaust here, exhaust, intake, exhaust. Okay, so that's how you can tell. So these 2 rockers here and these 2 rockers here next to that intake port here and here, these are intake rockers. Now, the method that I like to use the best, there's several different methods of valve adjustment. The one I like to use is what we call exhaust valve open, intake valve close. And you can do each cylinder at a time. You can do firing order method if you want. If you know how to do that, you can go through the firing order. This I've found is the simplest for people to understand. So I'm going to look at my rockers, my lifters down here. I'm just going to focus in on those lifters. And again, this is exhaust and this is intake. So now I'm going to rotate the crankshaft and I'm just going to watch my lifters. Now my intake is opening right now, so we're going to start on the front side here. So I'm going to go all the way around and let that close. And what I'm looking for is I want this exhaust lifter to just start to open, or in other words, the valve just starts to open. So I'm watching my exhaust lifter here. Keep your eye on this lifter as I rotate it. So there it goes. You can see it coming up off its base circle. I'll back up. We're going clockwise with the crankshaft now. So here comes your exhaust lifter. It just started to open. As soon as you see that start start to open, that's your adjustment point for the intake valve and rocker that is right next to it. The intake is right there. So the adjustment procedure, you guys, for this method is 0 lash plus 3/4 of a turn. So lash, let's describe what this is. This up and down, you see how that's loose? This rocker is loose. If this thing was, if you would try to start this now, this thing would be clattering like crazy. So we just came off of our base circle, and the adjustment is 0 lash plus 3/4 of a turn. So now I'm going to take my 5/8, and I'm going to run that nut down, and it gets tight right there. It actually gets pretty snug. So it takes some effort to get that on, and that's good. You want that tight because that crimp is grabbing that, and that's what's going to cause this to self-lock. But what I need to do is I need to go down and get rid of this lash. All of that up and down movement, you see there, that's got to go away. So I'm going to run this down until I just get rid of the up and down movement. I'm just going to pinch that push rod. I got a little bit left there. I'm going to go just a tad more. A little bit more. Oh, still got some movement. So we're just going to get to the point where I can't move this rocker up and down. I have just pinched this rocker between the rocker arm and the plunger and that lifter. Now, you're going to hear people post on here and say, well, I don't do it that way. I go down until I can't spin the push rod, or I have, you know, all these weird ideas, and they'll write the whole valve adjustment procedure out, and it's 100 times more complex than what we're doing here. Number one, the method of going down until you can't spin that push rod, that is completely wrong. If anybody tells you that, there is nowhere in any of GM's literature that tells you that you should be spinning that push rod. When I go to 0 lash, I can spin that push rod real easy, no problem. But I don't have any up and down movement here. So it's 0 lash plus a half to 3/4. I like to go 3/4. And what that does is that puts the push rod down in the travel of the plunger of that lifter, so now you're riding on that hydraulic cushion. If your lifters are bled down, which some of them will be, if the motor was shut off, and these are used lifters in here, and there was spring pressure on it, it will bleed the lifter down. If the valve was closed, the oil will be trapped in the lifter and it will be pumped up like a solid lifter. If you use the spin method, some of them are going to be way tighter than others. That's why it's ridiculous to do that. So if you hear anybody say, well, I go down until I spin the push rod, trust me, you're talking to somebody who does not know what they're doing. Just ignore that. Now that we have 0 lash, there's a half a turn and there's 3/4. So we went 3/4 of a turn. That rocker is now adjusted. Now let's take a look at our other lifter here, because we still have to adjust the exhaust here. Now we're going to go back down and take a look at our lifters, and we're going to rotate. Now this exhaust is going to open. So there it goes, it's opening, and we're going to open it all the way, and then we're going to close it. What we're doing is we're wanting to watch this intake to see that move. So now, what's interesting here, I want you to watch these lifters real close. We have something called overlap on the cam, and that's the period of time at the end of the exhaust stroke and the beginning of the intake stroke, where both these valves are open at the same time. I want you to watch the transition. So the exhaust is closing, and before this exhaust closes, you will see the intake start to open. So right there, those two are transitioning, and we have a period of time where both of those valves are open. That's called valve overlap. It's something that's necessary for cylinder scavenging. Okay, so back to our intake valve here. We're going to open our intake valve. Now on the exhaust, we just started to open and we did our adjustment. On the intake, it's a little different. We're going to go all the way up to maximum lift. So this is all the way up. And then as soon as that lifter starts to drop, or the valve starts to close, right there, it just started to drop. Now we are going to do 0 lash plus half a turn on our exhaust valve on that same cylinder. So we come back up here to our exhaust. Our intake just started to close. And same thing, we're going to run this down, guys, until now, once I get to the top, now it starts to get tight. That crimped area is grabbing the stud. But we're going to go down until we get rid of that. Now you got to be careful here, because with the 5/8 socket on here, if you're pushing too hard on this, or this is sitting on there, you're like, whoa, I have 0 lash. But then you take it off and you're like, oh no, I have a lot of lash. So this can actually push down on there and give you a false read. So you want to check this, run this down, and kind of pull your socket off there. Or make sure the socket's not all the way bottomed out on that stud. And then you can just feel your lash as you rotate. So we're going to go all the way around till that lash just disappears. Okay, a little more. No lash. Now I can spin it real easy. So the guys that are running this down until they can't spin it, their valves are going to be way too tight, especially if the lifter is bled down. All right, now we got 0 lash, and we're going to go half, 3/4 turn. Those 2 valves are now adjusted. You can go through and do every cylinder like that. Exhaust valve just starts to open, just the intake. Intake just starts to close, adjust the exhaust. And go through all 8 cylinders like that and you're in business. So I'm going to do the rest of these off camera. I won't bore you with all that. And once I get the rockers all adjusted, we'll come back and get ready to button this thing up. I appreciate you watching. We got our engine ready for our 1968 Chevy Malibu Wagon. It's not the original engine, but now a couple changes. One of the things is you'll notice it has stock looking valve covers and an intake that's painted orange. This is an Edelbrock intake, and we're going to put the tube in here. It has the provision for the tube, so it looks original. You'll notice that in the introduction, turn back on light, we had this manifold on here, but it wasn't painted. The customer wants it to look as original as possible, although I don't know how the custom timing cover with the Chevrolet logo on is going to help that. But he wanted the intake orange and he wanted the stock valve covers painted orange because he wants the engine to look completely original stock. And I understand it's a classic car. Even though we upgraded the pistons and gave it more compression and put a really nice camshaft in it, it's considerably better than the stock cam, and put a high volume oil pump on it with a high performance drive shaft, things of that nature. So it is going to be a much better running engine than it was in stock form. But I appreciate you watching, and this was a fun build. It's cool. Can't wait to see it run. I'm hoping that we can get some dyno shots of this and dyno testing once it's in the car or on an engine dyno or something of that nature. He keeps talking about stuff like that, so stay tuned. If I get an opportunity to film any of that, I will make an addendum or a small addition to this series. Thank you for watching. I've got much more coming up. I've got a 351 Windsor coming up next, and I've also got a 302 Ford. I've got a lot of stuff that needs to be done, and keep in mind it's going to be a little bit before I get that done. I've got a bunch of engine builds that I have to do in between that I'm not going to be filming, that I just need to get out. And so I appreciate you watching, and I will talk to you very soon, I promise.